This conference will now be recorded.
All right, great. So let's get started. So this is where we are. I just want to do a quick recap, take a couple of questions, and then we can get started with today's session out here. So yesterday we said that in order to start working with something called Azure, you need to go into something known as portal.azure.com. This is the website what you visit to, let's say, start your journey with Azure out there. Just a second. So you go to something called portal.azure.com and you go ahead and sign up yourself. So how did we sign up? We just took, let's say, an email ID. We just said we need this particular account. You got a code to that particular email ID, and then you gave that particular code, and then you got something called as an Azure tenant. This is the first thing we got. So now I'm telling that a tenant is nothing but a space on the Azure cloud wherein Azure will, let's say, identify you using your tenant ID, and Azure is going to give you or rent you some kind of a space in order to start working with the Azure cloud. This is what Azure is going to start doing out there. So the very first thing that got to me yesterday, or the very first thing that I went ahead and created yesterday, is known as a tenant, or is known rather as an Azure tenant out here. This is what I created yesterday first. So let's get the diagram of a tenant. This is how a tenant really looks like. Again, how do I check what is my tenant ID? I just go to portal.azure.com, and when I go to portal.azure.com, there is something called Azure Active Directory. I can click here, or I can click on these three dots. I can go into something called Azure Active Directory out here, and as and when I go here, it says this is my tenant ID, and this is also, let's say, my directory ID. So this is a tenant ID. This is something called directory ID. Either by this number or by this name, I can call my Azure tenant. This is what this is what I can do, or this is what Azure, let's say, gives me a capability to do out here. All right, so this is where we are. And after that, I said just a tenant will not help you out. The tenant just gives you a space. But if you want to start using Azure, you need to go ahead and create something known as an Azure subscription. This is what we said yesterday, is that you need to subscribe to Azure, just like you have a Prime Video, something like that. You need to subscribe for that. Just like that, you also need to, let's say, go ahead and subscribe to Azure, or you need to create something called as an Azure subscription. And I was telling yesterday that under one tenant you can have under one tenant you can have multiple subscriptions out here. And we also said, why do you need multiple subscriptions? Why do you even need multiple subscriptions when you have, let's say, one single subscription? Then we do, then we sorry, then we took an example of a company like Tata, and we said Tata can have, let's say, one single tenant, but they can have multiple companies which can have each and every subscription. Each and every user can log into one particular subscription. You can do such a kind of a restriction as what we are talking about. So this is what we are. This is where we are. We have a tenant and we have a subscription, and under one subscription you can go ahead and, let's say, start creating all Azure resources, like storage resources, like machines and all that stuff, which we'll get into. But any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here that I can take on what is a tenant, what is a subscription in Azure, what is what in Azure, and etc. So any questions still here? And guys in the back, you're able to hear me clearly? You're able to see my screen? Okay, great. Any questions till here, guys? Any questions that I can take till here? Are we good till here? That what is a tenant, what is a subscription, etc. Now
Yes, sir.
let's start. Yeah,
Yeah, hi, Kiran.
good, please.
I'm not able to see the full screen. How can I
Mhm.
enable that one?
So I won't be able to, let's say, control the full screen out there. So in the bottom at your end, do you have a zoom option out there? So you'll have to zoom out there, and then you'll have to, let's say, scroll through that particular screen. So it's the default
Oh,
way how this particular application really works.
okay. Yeah. Okay, Kiran.
Yes, any questions, guys? All right, so this is what I want to do today is that let's start with something called as user management, as we were talking about yesterday, that how can you go ahead add multiple users inside your subscription, inside your Azure account. How can you share how things work in an organization, what are different roles and etc. This is something that I want to now get into. So let's get there. So I have a tenant, I have a subscription. Now let's say, sorry, I have a tenant, I have a subscription. Now let's say I have a user. Let's say you are the only user in this particular tenant because you created this account. You'll become, let's say, the only user in this particular tenant. You are now working in an organization called Tata Motors, and you want to now add people inside your subscription or inside, let's say, give access to them to your subscription, share it, and all that stuff. So let's say there is a user, and I want to add this user to my Azure tenant. Now, all the users, whoever it is, if they want to access your Azure account, they will have to be a part of your Azure tenant out here. So let's say I have a user with this particular ID called classes Azure Devops test at the rate gmail.com. Let's say he's one of the users in your organization newly joined. So I'll firstly copy this ID. Again, this is something that I opened in an incognito window. It's a different browser that I opened this in. I'll go into my Azure portal. I'll say home. So let's start from here. I'll click here. I'll again go back into my Azure Active Directory. Again, Azure Active Directory is like a telephone directory out there. It's like it will contain all, let's say, the names, the users, and everyone who can access to your portal and etc. So I'll go into the Azure Active Directory, and inside the Azure Active Directory, there is something called what? Users, selling manage, and there is something called users out here. I'll click on users and I'll say plus new user. As of now, I have these two users and I have logged in using this particular account called classes Azure Devops. Do you see this? Because this user is a part of my directory, I'm able to use this particular account and log into Azure. If this user wasn't a part of my Active Directory, I wouldn't even able to be touch my account out here. So what I'll do is I'll now say new user, and there are two ways to add a user. One is called create a user, the other is called invite a user. We'll talk about both of them. We'll see how a create user works, how an invite user works. Where do you create a user versus where do you invite a user and etc. This is what we'll do. Firstly, we'll go to invite a user. It's asking what is the name of the user. I'll say the user's name is developer1. There's some name out here called developer1. It's asking me for what? Email address. I just copied an email address from this particular window, right? So this is an email address that I want to invite. I'll copy this out, come here, paste this out here. Then it's asking first name, last name. I'll say he's a developer and some last name optional out here. Just scroll down and there is something called block sign in and all that stuff. I'm leaving all these things out here. And also you can define one more thing. You can say what is the usage location, meaning where can this particular user sign into your account from? Meaning, is it only India or is it something like US? Where exactly? You can also have location preferences. You can also set location preferences, but I'm not doing anything those things out here. Again, job info, job title, optional in nature. So I'll say invite. Now it's telling inviting this particular user called developer whose ID is something like this. Whose ID is called what? Classes Azure DevOps test. Either it's something like this. And this is my ID. Don't get confused between both. I am logged in using classes Azure DevOps, but the developer's ID is what? Classes Azure DevOps test. It's a test email account that I created. And now do you see what it tells you? Successfully invited the user. But how do I know that the user is invited or not? Let's go back into the user account. This is an email ID that I'm logged in. Let's refresh the screen a couple of times. And after I refresh it a couple of times, again, it will take some time. And I will get an email to this particular ID telling that there is an invitation that is sent across. So what I'm doing right now is, let's wait for this one to load. Again, I should have got an email. Let's do this. Let's come back to the users. I'll say, let's see. This is invitation. This is great. This is good enough. I should have got an email, but it's taking some time for the email to come in. And after some time, the email now got in. So it will take around 2 or 3 minutes for you to get that particular email out here, depending upon internet connection and all that stuff. And let's go here into the email. And what is it telling you? Classes Azure DevOps invites you for their application with their organization. So this is the email generally that you get when you join an organization. You'll get an Outlook account mostly. For that particular Outlook account, you'll get this particular email telling that, okay, fine, do you want to join? Just scroll down, say accept invitation, and this will now take you to a sign up page telling, okay, fine, how do you want to, let's say, log in and all that stuff. So I'm getting inside this, and here it's telling classes Azure DevOps. It's asking me to give me, let's say, the password. I'll just go ahead give a password out here. Sign in, I'll say no, don't want to sign in here. And now this is the first step that you see, that do you want to review your permissions and all these things. I'll say accept, and after accepting all these terms and conditions, I'll be logged into the Azure portal. This is what I'll do. So this is how you can invite someone. So let's say you are using an email ID called abc@gmail.com. You want to invite your friends with, let's say, xyz@gmail.com. All you need to do is go into your Azure Active Directory, invite him, and make sure that he gets this particular email. After that, there's no apps to show and etc. So let's say again portal.azure.com, and this should take me into the tenant. So if I, as this particular user, now I am like what? A developer one. I'm logged in like a developer one. So I click on these three dots. I'll just go into something called Azure Active Directory. Do I see the same tenant ID? If I am logged in as a developer, what is the ID that I see? 27DE something ending with 6AB. If I am logged in with my account, now this is my account, classes Azure DevOps. Is it the same thing? Yes, no? It's the same thing. Both of us are logged in parallelly into the same Azure tenant, meaning multiple people, not one, not two, thousands of people can actually log into the same tenant, work parallelly with each other and all these things. This is how you invite a user. How did I, again, let's go to, let's review this process once again. I just went into you. I firstly came from here, said Azure Active Directory, went into something called users and said new user. And I said invite a particular user, gave name, gave the email ID, and just said invite out here. As and when I did that, you would be receiving an email, let's say to your, let's say, Gmail account or whatever your Outlook account is. Say accept invitation, accept all this particular defaults out here, and you are inside this particular account. This is how you can add a user as such. Yes, any questions, guys, still here on how do you add a user? Any questions on how do you add a particular user out here? And yeah, again, if the user will manage all the access, meaning the user you added, what is the permission he gets? Is that your question? We'll see that. We'll see that. We'll see what a user you add, what kind of a permissions he'll get, and etc. So again, where did we add this user, guys? To the Azure tenant. This is where we added that particular user. Now, this is my account. Classes Azure DevOps. This is my administrator account. If I go into subscriptions, I see this called Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, the same thing what I was, let's say, looking at yesterday. But if I go in as this particular user called classes Azure DevOps test, which is developer one, if I go inside this something called as subscriptions, you don't have any subscriptions out here. Why is it such? Why do you think it is like this? Anyone? Why do you think it is like this? Correct. We have added that particular user, but by the logic, if a user is added, he should also be able to see the subscription like I am doing. Then why isn't he, let's say, he doesn't have any such permissions, and exactly he doesn't have any such permissions. He doesn't have any permissions on your Azure subscription. This is what I'm coming down to. Meaning, if a user is part of your tenant, it doesn't mean that he has access to all the subscriptions under the tenant. Let's say again, same example. I am an administrator working for an organization called Tata. You are, let's say, an employee of Tata Motors. Three employees come to me. One is a Tata Motor, one is a Tata Steel, one is a Tata, let's say, Finance. Three different, let's say, companies out here. I just add them into the tenant. I did not add them into any subscriptions. Now I get to decide how can I add a user into a subscription, and while adding the user, what kind of a permission do I need to give to this particular user when I add him. This is what the permissions kind of define out here. So we just added the user out here into the tenant. The user that I added called developer one doesn't have any access or doesn't even see subscriptions out here. This user cannot even see subscriptions out here. In order to add him into the subscription, I have to go inside my subscription firstly. So let's do that. So firstly, let's do that. So I'm in the home page. After the home page, just say subscriptions. Go into something called Visual Studio or free trial subscription, what you do have. All these things that you see on the left hand side of my screen, which is this one that I'm pointing out to. Just you see overview, you see activity log, you see all these things. All these things are the options that Azure provides you to interact with, let's say, a particular resource, like let's say a subscription in my case. So I am interacting with a subscription, and all these are the options for me to interact with a subscription. And technically, these are not called as options, but we call them as blades. We call them as blades out here. These are called blades, and blades under a subscription. So normally when you call options, it's not technically called as options. We just call them as blades. So just kind of remember that. In this, there are multiple things. Like for example, there is a blade called overview. What does this do? It'll just tell you what is your subscription ID, what is the subscription name, what is the billing period that you're in. My billing period starts from 11th to, let's say, a particular month, ends on 10th, and it's telling me different thing. It's what is the role and etc. And it is telling me what is the cost that I have done over a period of time and etc. And there is something also called activity log. Activity log gives you an idea of what you have done over, let's say, a particular period of time. For example, I, as this particular user, I went ahead, created a lot of resources and etc. in my earlier class. So it has all this timestamp here. Finally, one very important thing, there is something called access control, in brackets IAM. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. So what I do is I go into IAM under the subscription. Under the blade of a subscription, there is a blade called access control. In the bracket, there is something called IAM, Identity and Access Management, under which I had something called what? Add. If I say add, there is something called what? Add a role assignment. I'll say add a role assignment. And now there are multiple roles that you can actually select from in Azure. If you look at the Azure portal gives you a lot of roles that you can add, meaning a lot of permissions that you can add. And all these roles that you see here in this particular Azure portal are technically called as RBAC, role based access controls. So let's write that down. So if you want to add a user, firstly, we added him to the tenant. He has to be a part of your tenant to even log in. After that, you now get to decide which subscription you want to add him. Because under a particular tenant, you can have hundreds of subscriptions literally. Now I can decide as an administrator that which subscription do I want to this, or do I want to add this particular, let's say, developer into. And when I'm adding them, there is something called RBAC that I need to decide on: role based access control. Now, what does really RBAC talk about? Now, RBAC, or role based access control in Azure, tells that there are broadly three categories of roles that you can give someone. Broadly, I'm just telling a very broad classification. The first role is called as a role of an owner. I am an owner to my subscription. For example, if I go here, if I come into the subscriptions, do you see my role called owner? So this is my role, and I am now what? Owner. There is one more thing called contributor. And finally, there is one broad classification. Again, there are multiple roles. I'm just giving you a very broad classification of the roles out here. There's something called as reader. Now, what can each and every role do? If you give someone a role, what it can exactly do out here is that, let's talk about owner. Let's come from owner, let's go to contributor, and then let's go to reader out here. The role of an owner is like an administrator, wherein the owner can, let's say, double click on this one, the owner can add, modify, and delete users. The owner can do this. He can add, like I did, I added a user, I can also delete a user, I can also, let's say, modify the permissions of a particular user. The owner can add, modify, or delete resources. What do I mean by resources is that when you're using Azure portal, you deal with resources primarily, like let's say resources belonging to storages, like let's say resources like virtual machines and all these things out, which we will be looking at what are the resources, etc. So as an owner, I can go ahead, do a user management, meaning I can go ahead, add a user just like I did, I can delete a user, I can also go ahead and, let's say, modify the permissions of a user and all these things out. I can also go ahead and, let's say, add, modify, delete resources and all these things out. But as a contributor, what can I do? Let's see that practically as what can I do as a contributor. So what I'll do is I'll go into my subscription, again go into something called identity and access management. Until now the user has not been added. I'll say add the user. I'll say role assignment, and in here I'll say contributor role. I'm not giving an owner role, I'm saying contributor role. I'll say next, and here it's asking users, groups, or service principals. Will check that what it is. It's saying selected role is contributor. What is the user you want to assign this role to? I'll say select members, and this is the user that I'm, let's say, interested in, developer one who I just added. I'll say developer one, this is the user I'm, let's say, selected. I'll say select. I will say review and assign. In the review and assign, it'll just tell me that okay, fine, you are assigning a role called contributor on a subscription with this particular, let's say, ID called something like this, to a user called developer one, who's a guest user. The reason it's telling it's a guest user is because I have invited a Gmail account. We'll talk about what is a create user and etc. And I'll say review and assign. Now it's telling assigning a role. So in order for you to assign a role, the user should already also, I mean, already be a part of your tenant. That's what we started with. We added the user to the tenant, and then we added a role. And after that, we'll say added a role assignment to this particular user called something what, as a contributor. So I added developer one as a contributor. What does it exactly do? As a contributor, this particular developer can do everything what an owner can do. This is what I'm telling. This is a statement that I'm making. And do everything an owner can do minus or apart from user management. A contributor cannot do a user management, meaning I as a contributor, I cannot add, delete or modify users. What an owner can do. So an owner and a contributor can do the same apart from the user management. Let's also see how it behaves now. So I have added this particular developer as a contributor. Let's go back into that particular account. So this is the developer's account, developer. Let's refresh this out. Again, it will take some time to reflect all these permissions and etc. Do you now see a subscription called something like this? And it is telling me there is something called what?
Yeah.
Specified access. It is not an owner right now. Let's go in here. And what I try to do right now is that now I'm logged in as a contributor. I want to, let's say, add one more user. Let's say I'm a contributor. I want to, let's say, add one more user. Again, where should I go? IAM. What should I do? Add. But do you see what happens out here?